going to get started. It is my pleasure to introduce Margot Jackson, who will be our speaker today, who is an associate professor at Brown University. Margot's work broadly focuses on some issues of social inequality and public policy, with a particular focus on family, children, and health outcomes. Her work recently, which we'll be talking about, I believe, today, is an investigation of how class inequality affects parental investments and parenting practices that are strongly implicated in child's development. Margot received her PhD from UCLA, and her work has been published in a number of leading journals, including Demography, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Social Science and Medicine. So without further ado, please welcome Margot Jackson.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for taking time out on Monday. I know it's that time in the semester when we're all feeling really stressed out, or at least I am. I won't speak for you. So it's nice to be back, see some familiar and new faces. I think I was last year, I was talking to Hyunjun in 2012, something like that. So I'm getting old, time flies. So I'm going to be talking today about a paper that's in progress, and it's in collaboration, as you see here, with Danny Schneider, who's at Berkeley. And this is the first project for which I was telling people this morning, actually needed money to do the work. And so the first part of it, which will kind of get glossed over a little bit today, has been a data assembly effort to kind of administer and collect a state-by-year database of public investments, public spending in children and families. And then the kind of more exciting part is linking the database to survey data to test ideas about how governments and families both work together to influence children's context and well-being. So as I said, the project is motivated by the idea that both families and governments provide critical support for children. And the key question that I'm going to be talking about today, which I'll explain a lot more about, is whether specifically class gaps in parental investments, right, of what have increasingly come to be called parental investments in children, which today is going to mean parental expenditures on developmental goods for children, whether those gaps are narrower in state contexts that are more generous, right, for public spending, particularly for programs that are focused on children and families. And so the project is kind of motivated by two literatures that are both very large, but in sociology at least have largely been relatively separate, and now I'm realizing why, because of data demand. And the first does not need much introduction, but many of you are familiar with the voluminous literature on the role of the family in producing patterns of inequality, right, both within and across generations. And so family sociologists and demographers, of course, have taught us a lot about the ways in which family resources and investments generate patterns of inequality, both within and across generations. And more recently, right, there's a growing body of work documenting the ways in which parental behavior in particular may be an important mechanism for reinforcing, reproducing, potentially attenuating, although there's not as much evidence for that, the kind of striking degree of class variation that exists in families. And so the kind of takeaway from this very large literature, and I'll show you some illustrative examples, is that parenting practices differ quite substantially by class. So I'm going to show you, for those of you who are less engaged with this particular literature, a series of illustrative examples. You don't even have to read the empirical literature on this topic, right, to kind of have an understanding of the kind of striking takeoff in class differences and class divides in parenting practices, right? So all you have to do is go to the New York Times and you see headline after headline about the ways in which class differences in child rearing are on the rise, right? Some people go so far as to say that modern parenting is relentless, right, to the extent that it's kind of associated with increasing expectations that are very class-oriented. And, you know, relevant to my talk today, there's evidence even of a striking class divide in parents' ability to purchase toys, right, which we actually may think of as a form of developmental good for children. So the popular press has certainly caught wind of the fact that class inequality is striking, and that what happens in the family, right, is a potentially important component of that. So if you don't believe just the headlines, right, and you want to get a sense of the key findings from this literature, this is a finding from a paper, one of Danny Schneider's other papers with some colleagues, that shows, looking at consumption, that patterns of child-specific investment, in this case is parental expenditures on children, are unsurprisingly highly stratified by class, right? And this just kind of gives a nice striking sense of the degree to which income differences in expenditures are extremely class stratified, also in a very kind of monotonic way. So a lot of work that exists in this space focuses on consumption. If you look beyond consumption to look at the content of parents' time with children, we see similar class divides. So this is a finding from a paper by Ariel Khalil and colleagues. And the graph on the left documents educational differences in the amount of total time that parents spend with children, minutes in total care. So the blue is college-educated parents, and the green is the lowest educated parents. And we can see they show us not only that there are educational differences in the total amount of time that parents are able to spend with children, but they go so far as to argue that there's what they call a developmental gradient, where the size of educational differences in parents' time use are especially large between ages 3 and 5, when they argue are these kind of critical periods of investment, right, in children's cognitive development. So this is just to give you a sense of the degree to which class behavior or family behavior is class stratified, both with respect to consumption as well as kind of the content of time. And by the way, I should have said, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions as I talk. Like many of you probably, I get sick of listening to myself talk for long periods of time the more I teach, so please feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so not only are there striking differences in consumption, right, and in the content of parents' behavior with children, we also see some evidence that the size of investment gaps has increased over time. So this is a finding from a paper from a few years ago by Altintas and JMF that shows that in the 1960s, there were smaller educational differences. So the dotted line here is parents who have a college degree or higher, right? And we can see that in the 1960s, there were educational differences that, you know, flopped around a little bit, but generally grew over time up until the most recent period that they observed, right? Although I was talking to Hyunjun just now and was telling me that right around that time, there actually seemed to be a stalling of class differences where they stopped rising, but that's beyond the scope of our focus here. Okay, and then just, oh yeah, please. Yeah. The two axes? Yeah, no, this is just minutes of developmental care, and then the x-axis is the change over time by education. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm showing you a snippet of illustrative examples that for both income and education. For consumption, right, expenditures in the family, there is a fair amount of evidence that that extends to both income and education. A lot of the work for time use has focused on educational differences in particular, and especially mother's education because, you know, for lots of reasons. But by and large, I think it's safe to say that this evidence extends to both income and education. Okay. Just one last kind of illustrative example to give you a sense of this literature. This is a finding from one of my papers meant to convince you that this is not a phenomenon that's confined to the United States. So this is data from the United Kingdom looking at changes across birth cohorts. So from 1958 up until the most recent birth cohort in 2000. And here I'm looking at another form of parental investment in the form of mother's health behaviors. And so we can see that in 1958, for breastfeeding and for prenatal smoking, the size of educational differences, this is the 90-10 educational gap in each cohort. Educational differences were present, but small, and they increased steadily and fairly dramatically up until the most recent birth cohort in 2000, right? And we see that for breastfeeding, and we see that for prenatal smoking exposure. So this is a phenomenon that has changed over time, both in the United States and in a lot of other societies. Okay.
Are 90-10 the education that you mentioned, because in terms of the percentile rank based on years of education?
This is percentile rank, yeah. Based on years of education, and there's some interesting work by Sean Reardon that is kind of focused on trying to convert categorical measures of educational attainment into percentile ranks, and so I've had to do some of that here as well. But, okay, So in thinking about ways to go about reducing these stark divides, right, in parental investment, one possible explanation focuses on kind of trying to bring about kind of a dramatic cultural change, right? So many of you are probably familiar with the recent book by Richard Reeves at the Brookings Institution about dream hoarders, right, which essentially makes an argument that high SES parents are engaging in a form of opportunity hoarding, right, that reduces opportunity and resources for families lower in the economic or socioeconomic distribution, right? And an oversimplified version of the argument is if we want to reduce these divides in family behavior, we need to get high SES families to start acting differently, right? And to stop what a lot of media sources like NPR and the New York Times have come to call overparenting, right? Or intensive parenting practices that are so class stratified. So that's one argument, right? It's a compelling argument. An alternative perspective is that it's quite difficult to bring about such an intense form of cultural change, right? Particularly when approaches to bringing about that cultural change focus on the top of the economic distribution. So I'm interested in an alternative possibility for reducing inequality in family behavior, which focuses on the role of public investments, right? That is state-level government investments in children and families. And in particular, I'm interested in the possibility that public investments may be a compelling way to narrow class gaps in what we see in the family, particularly because of their disproportionate or potentially disproportionate impact on the behavior of low SES families, right? So we know from large literatures that children are influenced not only, of course, by the family context and other social settings that are more proximate, right, like neighborhoods and schools, but also by political institutions, and more broadly, what we might think of as the size of the welfare state, right? And so public investments, which as you'll see, I'm going to be operationalizing in the form of public spending and generosity of public spending, are a good way to indicate essentially the strength of the welfare state, right? And so it's possible that those types of investments, to the extent that they indicate the welfare state, may have an equalizing effect on family behavior. It's possible that they may not as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And one of the primary ways that we think that might work is essentially through a resource pathway, right, that frees up resources, particularly for low SES families and parents, to not only spend more money in general, but potentially to reallocate their expenditures away from basic necessities, right, and toward more explicitly kind of developmentally oriented investments. Okay. And certainly there's lots of theory and evidence from economics and from sociology that would suggest that these forms of public investments kind of directly can affect outcomes for low-income children. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean by public investments, right, and a little bit of the kind of structure and content and trends of public investments, so you can understand better what I'm talking about, right, throughout the talk. So a couple of features of public investment for children that I think are especially relevant here. One is to understand, major forms of spending, right? What do we mean? What are we talking about empirically when we talk about public spending? The vast majority of public spending on children and families is in education, right? It's quite dominated by education spending, particularly K through 12 spending, right? And so that's a really large feature of public investment. And then after education, which is the lion's share of both federal and state spending on children, 5 spending and tax programs comprise the majority of spending on children, and that includes Medicaid, right, a major provider of health insurance for low and moderate income families, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, SNAP, which is the food stamp program in the US, and the dependent exemption, right? So when we talk about public investment, we're talking about 2 large categories and domains of spending, one of which is quite progressive and income targeted, and the other is what we might think of as a universalist investment, right? That is K through 12 education. Another feature of public investment that's relevant, and we're going to do a little bit to explore today, is the extent to which it's progressive versus universal, right? So unlike the stark divides in private investment that I showed you by class, a lot, but not all, of public investment in children is targeted, right, and disproportionately flowing toward low-income children. That's especially true for programs like income support and health investments, right, that are disproportionately targeted. But there are some important exceptions, namely K through 12 education, right? Some are progressive and targeted, some are universalist. Certainly some education investments like Head Start, public pre-K programs are targeted and income tied, but K through 12 education, which is the lion's share of education spending, is available, of course, to all children. And so the welfare states literature has kind of a healthy debate of whether we might expect targeted versus universalist investments to have more of an effect on inequality, right? So on the one hand, we might think that targeted investments, to the extent that they kind of efficiently direct resources to low SES families, should have more of an effect on narrowing class gaps, right? On the other hand, universalist investments tend to be much more popular. They're more politically palatable. They're more likely to be sustained and supported over time, right? And some argue that that type of political effect, right, makes those programs more likely in the long run to have a redistributive and inequality narrowing effect. And I don't think there's much evidence one way or another, certainly not for the case of child investment, but it's not a priori clear, right, whether targeted or universalist investments should have a larger effect on the amount of inequality, right, that we see. Okay, and then a third feature, I think a final feature of public investment that's relevant for us just kind of to have in our minds is that public spending, particularly on children, is increasingly under threat, right? Certainly in the United States budget. All forms of public spending have increased over time, right? We spend more money on all populations over time, but public spending on children has grown much more slowly than public spending on adults, right? And it's projected to decline as a share of the federal budget, unlike spending and investments on adults. So just to give you a sense, this is a table from the Urban Institute that shows expenditures. These are federal expenditures on children as a share of the GDP in a lot of different categories in 2015, and then projections for 2026. So you can just focus on the percent change column, and the kind of key takeaway here is that for most domains of public sector investment in children, there's a projected decline, right, in this investment as a share of the GDP. If I were to show you this table for adults, that percent change column would look positive for the most part, right? Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah, and so we're going to be looking at federal and local spending, but education is a tricky example because the local and state investments, right, are much more regressive than the federal investments, but they're also a large component of it. Yeah, so it's certainly not a monolithic claim. Okay, and this is just another way of showing a similar thing, right, which is that the blue on the bottom here, this is showing by decade spending on children and on other populations. The gray is adults, right, and we can see that that blue spending on children has either remained steady or is projected to decline over time, in contrast, right, to the steady uptick in spending on adults, right? So many of you are probably familiar with this, but just to kind of give you a sense of the funding context, right, for children over this period. You know, one kind of very timely example, right, is that the federal budget includes a projected $1.5 trillion cut in Medicaid over a 10-year period, right, which is, of course, a major provider of health insurance for children. Okay. So thinking about why public investments should affect class gaps, right, I mentioned this kind of dominant pathway that we have in mind, which is a resource pathway, right, and essentially the idea is that public investment should provide a floor of investment, right, to particularly low resource families that allows them to free up resources, right, to spend on additional investment goods, in particular learning items and types of stimulating activities and goods that are implicated in children's development. Okay. We think that this should be most pronounced for more progressively oriented spending programs, particularly for income security. There's more evidence for income security, and we think it should work similarly for health investments because health spending on children is so dominated by Medicaid and state health insurance programs. Okay, and the logic is that these programs kind of efficiently flow resources, right, directly to low resource families who are the most poised to benefit from them. Okay. Alternatively, oh, sorry, yeah. And there's a state component as well. Yeah, we're looking at both. Yeah, so we're looking at all spending in states from federal, state, and local sources. For a program like EITC, that would include both the federal component and the state component. Yeah, most but not all states, right, have an EITC, but it's much smaller than the federal. Yeah. Okay. In contrast, we think that education spending as a kind of universalist investment, right, may have a more limited inequality narrowing effect. So certainly, as I said, Head Start, right, public pre-kindergarten programs are very progressive, but they're a very small share of total education spending, right? And the vast majority of children, low resource children, are going to attend public schools regardless, right, of the degree to which education investment is more or less generous, right? It's something like 5%, I think, of low resource children attend private schools. Okay? So we may expect that these types of universalist investments may have more modest effects on narrowing income gaps and education gaps. Okay. So in sum, we think that this resource-based perspective would suggest that more generous public investment should reduce class disparities. An alternative perspective, right, which we can kind of indirectly adjudicate between, is what we might broadly call a kind of parenting preferences, or for lack of a better term, cultures, right, perspective. The resource-based hypotheses that I've been talking about implicitly assume that all parents have the same preferences, right, and want to make the same types of developmental investments in their children. It is, in theory, possible that class gaps in investment may instead be a function, right, in addition to economic constraints, of broadly kind of construed parenting styles or beliefs, right, that are intertwined with economic constraints, but may also be independent, right? And so if you take, for example, your own Annette LaRose landmark study, certainly culture and economic constraints were intertwined, but working class respondents described an aversion, right, to the types of intensive practices that were so commonly observed and seemingly valued among high resource families, right, in that study. So from that perspective, it's possible that this kind of preferences or culture-based perspective would suggest that class gaps may be relatively insensitive to the generosity of public spending, right? I would note as a caveat, some of you have probably read some of the recent interesting survey experiment and vignette work, right, that shows that on a national scale, at least, most parents, in fact, have very similar preferences. So that kind of undercuts, right, this hypothesis, but it is theoretically possible. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on states, right, and for a couple of interesting reasons, both theoretical and empirical. The U.S. welfare state is very federalist, right? It's very state stratified, and we think that this provides a valuable opportunity to adjudicate between these two different perspectives, right? Certainly, as you know, policy discussions are increasingly focused on states as the level at which policies are produced, administered, right, created or not, behaviors are regulated or sanctioned or not. There's a lot of research on the size of the state, right, and its effects on people's behavior. The majority of this research is cross-national for good reason. It's easier to measure the size of welfare states at the national level than at the state level. But of course, country-level analyses may confound the effects of public investment with lots of unobserved country-level characteristics, right, that are correlated with both spending and family context. Okay, so we're shifting our focus to the smaller area of the state, where there is still quite substantial variation in spending. This just gives you a sense in 1 year. This is 2013. The darker states are the higher spending states, right? That we can see that there's a substantial amount of variation in the amount that states are investing from federal and state and local sources in children in those states. Okay. Oh, yeah, this is just so weird. It was 2013. I think there was just a data issue. It's not off the chart. Okay, so what are we going to do? I thought, oh, it'll be great. We'll just measure state spending, and then we'll do this paper. And then I learned that it's really hard to do that. So I applied for some grants and luckily got some funding, and have been working in collaboration with people at the Urban Institute who have an amazing array of expertise in all things related to public sector investment. So if you ever get involved in policy, I highly recommend bringing people from the Urban Institute into your team. And so what we've been doing over the last year or so is constructing a longitudinal state-by-year database of all things spending related to children and families. And I'll show you a table on the next slide that has all of the programs that we consider. But what this has involved is integrating and harmonizing data from over about a 20-year period, from 1995 up until 2016, actually, of all major programs from local, state, and federal sources serving children and families. And so we look at 4 domains: income support, health, education, and other spending, and arrive at a series of measures, including the one that I'll be focusing on today, which is real spending per child. Here I'm using 2014 dollars in thousands of dollars, okay? And we can look at this for the total bundle of public sector resources that families access, and specifically by program. Okay. So this is the set of programs that we've considered so far. Education, as I said, is highly dominated by spending on K through 12, but also includes federal Head Start and public pre-kindergarten programs, as well as programs that we think are kind of less directly targeted to children, but affect mothers especially and parents, with things like Pell Grants, right? But definitely dominated by K through 12. And then we have major income security programs, again at the federal, state, and local level. Health, which is dominated by Medicaid, and then this other category, which is largely housing, but includes a grab bag of other programs as well. Okay, so this is the set of programs that we combine to create a bundle, right, of the total state context of public sector investments. Okay, we have that database, state-by-year database over time, and we're linking it to household survey data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. Here we're going to be using data from 1997 to 2014. Many of you are probably familiar with this survey. It's a nationally representative survey of anything and more than you ever wanted to know about the expenditures of U.S. households. It's a household quarter structure, right? So households are present anywhere from 1 to 4 times, and respondents are providing information every quarter, about 12 consecutive months. Importantly, for our purposes, we have state identifiers, right? So we can look at the state context in addition to income and expenditures. So, sorry, did someone say something? Oh, no. Okay. We're going to be focusing on 2 measures of class: income, household income, and parental education. I'll show you models that come from logged continuous income, and then we convert those measures to use predictions to look at income ranks, right, to get a sense of income differences. And then I'll look at parental education measured in the kind of standard categorical way. Okay. We've used a lot of different expenditure measures, and I've presented versions of this paper with lots of different measures, and it gets very confusing very quickly. And so today I'm going to be focusing, because there's a lot going on with both the public and the private investment, on spending on what we've kind of called developmental goods, right? So these are items that we would argue comprise a form of developmental investment. They're not basic necessities, right? But they're things like arts and crafts, instruments, books, learning activities, bikes, right, et cetera, okay? And we're looking at this for all children. We have done some models where we look at this stratified by age, right? But here we're including these expenditures for children under age 18, right, in the household. And then we've got a lot of other measures at the household and the state level that we're measuring annually, and I'm happy to talk more about any of those measures. Okay, so our approach is pretty straightforward. We're going to be using variation within states over time, right, to identify these models. So we're using models with state and year fixed effects to essentially describe the association between public investment and both income and education gaps. in parents' developmental expenditures, right? And so as you could imagine, there are a lot of fixed state differences, right? Differences across states, certainly in the level of economic need, demographic composition, labor market structure, right? And so we want to capture those differences, as well as, importantly, during our time period, shared time trends like the Great Recession, right? So we need to be able to control for some of those time trends. So as I said, these are models that are coming from variation within states over time. Feel free to tell me that there's lots of unobserved changes in states that we're not measuring, right? I totally agree with you and would love to talk more about that. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what's going on here, these are just box plots, right, that show you the amount of variation across and within states over years. This is total spending, right? You can see much of the variation in spending is coming during that increase in economic need, right, during the recession. So not all, but a lot of the variation in our models is coming from that period, right, in this 20-year window or 15-year window. Income support spending, right, is more variable than other forms of spending, and again coincides with that increase in economic need, especially during the Great Recession. And health and education spending change over time and generally increase, but are less variable, right, than income support spending. So this is health spending by year, and this is education spending. So just to give you a sense, right, of the general patterns over time. Okay, so key question, as I said, are class gaps in parents' developmental expenditures smaller when state spending is higher? This graph shows you the marginal effect of income on this form of developmental expenditure. So the x-axis here is total state spending at the mean and 1 and 2 standard deviations below. And the takeaway from this graph, right, is that we see smaller income gaps, right? The relationship between income and developmental expenditure is smaller when state spending is higher. Okay, so that's suggestive, but doesn't tell us much about kind of the nature of gaps. So what we do is to generate predictions, right, from these models where we break families up by income rank. And so what we have here is, again, total state spending on the x-axis. And the bottom line here is the 10th percentile of the income distribution, and the top line is the 90th percentile. And so what we see is that when state spending is quite low, right, 2 standard deviations below the mean, income differences in expenditures are quite pronounced, right, on the order of 95% for this one form of expenditure. As state spending increases, we see this gap begin to converge, right, so that when state spending is 2 standard deviations above the mean, income differences are not non-existent, right, but they reduce in size by about half. Okay. Yeah.
One state to the left, one state to the right, and one down. So I wonder on kind of percentage variation, if you say have to be clustered mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So while we say
How many?
Relevance to the
right. No.
deviation there is less than one state.
Right. So this is just to remind myself, like, what is an example, right, of what would constitute a standard deviation, right? So Alabama, for example, right, between 1998 and 2009, a 1 standard deviation change here is about $5,000 of spending per child. And so that would be roughly the amount of spending change that we saw, for example, in Alabama over a 10-year period, right? So we're using, obviously every state had a different amount of change over time, but we're using that type of variation to make, so I don't, so obviously these are simulated, right, from their predictions from the model, but I think there's a number of states that would fall into that would meet that criterion, right, of having, for example, a 1 standard deviation change during the period that we're observing. I don't know if that helps or not, right? Okay. So, when we begin to extrapolate beyond the marginal effects, right, and look at income differences and across the income distribution, we're seeing that income gaps begin to converge, and importantly, the convergence that we're seeing, or the change in behavior, right, in expenditure, is coming from changes at the bottom of the income distribution. And as you can see, there's really not much going on as you'd expect, right? At least to the extent that we think most public investment is progressive, there's not much going on at the top of the income distribution, right? So converging income gaps that seem to be driven especially by behavior at the lower end of the income distribution. Okay. I gave you an example, right, of what would constitute a standard deviation change in spending. When we look at this by education instead of income, this is parental education. The green is college or higher. The orangey is lower educated, lowest educated parents. And what we see here is generally consistent with what we saw for income, right? Educational differences are more pronounced when state spending is quite low, right? And as spending increases, educational differences converge, and in this case, ever so slightly flip, right? Which I'm not making too much of that, right? But we see this pattern of convergence as we move across, right, the state context of investment. And again, the convergence is driven by what kind of action at the bottom of the educational distribution. Okay.
Interaction between income and education, because those look a little different, right? So that, or what's the distribution of income within those educations?
Oh.
Just to get a little bit of a sense of how important is income for education.
Yeah.
You can read it without having to
Right.
higher level of tools. So how much is really driven by income? How are you controlling for
Mm-hmm.
income,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, no, it's
an interaction between income and education.
yeah, we haven't looked at that, which I should. It's a good question. You know, theoretically, I think it's less immediately obvious, right? Why we would expect public investment to affect the educational gaps, like net of income, right? But it's not implausible, right? No, but we haven't looked at an interaction between education and income. I think we would probably, right. And are we seeing this convergence only among lower income groups or something like that? Yeah, we can definitely look at that. Yeah.
So it's a take-home message here is when the public spending increases, so family expenditure on education also increases. So why not?
Yes, so when public spending increases, we're seeing increasing expenditures, particularly among low income and low educated households.
So I'm thinking that this policy that also is actually inequality among or between states. You know, for states that if they increase their public spending, so family will also respond to that, so they will invest in their children more.
High
So
SES
that
family.
we will widen gaps between states,
Mm-hmm.
but narrowing gaps within states.
Yes, that is definitely plausible. And we can look at that. We're not looking at that here, obviously, because these are coming from within state models. But we could definitely do that. It would be interesting to do, I guess, a secondary part that is, you know, especially over this period, right? Like, do we see widening between state inequality as state spending increases? Yeah. It's not immediately clear what the right mechanism, like what the hypothesis would be. I could see it going either ways.
Well, the children actually teach me like if state expenditure increases, then in those states the parents will know so there's gotta be increasing gap or it's not.
Mechanically, yes, I think that's right. You know, we were originally, and we still are, interested in the possibility that, especially for certain types of expenditures, it may be the case that, take the case of education spending, for example, we wouldn't necessarily expect education spending to dramatically affect the behavior of low resource families, right? But we might actually expect it to free up resources for high SES families. And then they can, you know, engage even more in the type of intensive parenting, right, that we think is so common. But that wouldn't necessarily, that would do more for the within state, right, gaps.
So we have to look at what kind of expenditure matters, because here, if you give money, then we have no money to spend. If you are finding the education is that education setting is hard to research, right? You know, if you look at Philadelphia, you know, there are probably 10 miles apart, there are excellent public schools and shitty public schools. But you don't really tax that with the state law.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think the education spending is harder to ensure that then maybe the money that's here.
Yes. Right, then the direct cash
So I'm wondering, have you looked at separately
by
by the components of your
So yes, that's what I'm going to show you next. And you probably won't be satisfied for education because we're still doing the kind of total bundle of education spending. But yes, we're starting to do that. Okay, so far, right, we see this evidence that income and educational differences seem to be converging. Again, it's importantly driven by what's happening kind of at the bottom of the distribution, especially. Okay, notwithstanding all these excellent caveats. Mm-hmm. Mm.
When I was looking at that list of spending that you're capturing, it really seems targeted for relatively young patients.
Yeah, I mean, oh, I see. You mean the family expenditures? Yeah.
Your college spending is captures
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yep.
But the consumer expenditure data captures things that are really only relevant for very young children. How well are you
Yes and no. I mean, so we do look at this stratified by age, even just the amount. I should have shown just a descriptive table of the amount of expenditures. And it's definitely a relevant feature of expenditures for all ages. It's just driven by different items within it, right? So obviously infant equipment, right, is less relevant for teenagers, but musical instruments and games and, you know, what they call learning books are not, I mean, that applies to everyone. That's basically books, right? And so I think the category overall is equally relevant. It's just driven by different components for different ages. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I think so. Okay. So the last kind of, you know, empirical thing, right, that I want to show you is this question of, do we see evidence, right, that the size or these class gaps and the convergence that we're seeing varies by the type of public investment, right? And in particular, what we might think of as broadly progressive versus broadly universalist or maybe even regressive forms of public investment. So the main thing that we do to look at this is to break it up by kind of major domain of public spending, particularly income support, health, and education. So this is just to show you, here we've got the coefficients from tables that have interactions. This is household income, the state spending, right, where the type of state spending is either income support, health, or education, and the interaction between household income and spending. And without focusing on, you know, the magnitude and the predictions, happy to talk more about that. We're generally finding, right, that for income support and health investments, which are more progressive, we find a larger interaction, right, if we pay attention to the top term, between household income and state investment than we do for education spending, which is that more, again, less targeted, right, form of investment at the state level. So this is kind of broadly consistent with the idea that the increasing expenditures that we're seeing among low resource families and the resulting declining class gaps seem to be especially pronounced for more progressive and targeted forms of investment. Okay. Now, we don't break up education spending or any of these forms of spending by local, state, or federal source, right, which would be very interesting and mildly overwhelming to think about doing, but we could definitely do that. Okay, so I'll sum up a little bit. I want to leave time for more questions if people have it. So as I said, you know, the paper is kind of motivated by this, what we kind of call the federalist character, right, of the U.S. welfare state. Theoretically, I think this is an interesting opportunity, right, to kind of move the welfare state's literature a little bit more local, so to speak, and ask questions like whether the state context of support is associated with patterns of inequality, right, which we don't know a lot about empirically. It also theoretically, I think, is an interesting opportunity to test different hypotheses about resources versus kind of preferences, right, and culture. And empirically, I think that kind of state stratified, right, context of public investment in the U.S. allows us to use that variation across time and place to control for a lot of important differences across state and time. So our key findings from the paper so far are first that more generous public investment seems to be associated with reductions in class gaps, in parental investment. And we haven't talked much about the magnitude. In the paper, we talked more about that. But here we're looking at one form of expenditures, right, in families, and we're finding, we're looking at quarterly expenditures, and we're finding on the order of $100 to $300 per year, right, reductions in in income and education gaps for this one form of investment, right? So if you think about extrapolating that beyond this one form of investment to total family investment, we think that the effect of public investment on these total private expenditures may be large, right? Because we're looking at just one form of investment here. As I said, we also find that narrowing class gaps seem to be especially driven by changing behavior at the bottom of the economic distribution and not at the top, which is one of the things we wanted to test. And so this is kind of broadly more consistent with a resource pathway, we think, than with this kind of possibility of differential preferences, right, by class, where we'd expect to see not much of a change across groups. Okay? So we think that the local context of the state, right, or we don't think, we know, right, from a lot of work that the local context of the state is really an important institution, right, an increasingly important institution for influencing individuals' behavior and their outcomes, right? States are increasingly the context for regulating behavior, right, for deciding what behaviors are legal or not, and more generally regulating behavior for their populations. And so we have a lot of good work on the effects of the state context on population health, on psychosocial well-being, on mortality, right? And so we're finding here evidence that the state context of investment also shapes the family context of investment, right? Which is a kind of straightforward idea that hasn't had a lot of empirical evidence. Okay. And then when we go on to disaggregate public investments into these targeted versus universalist investments, as I said, we're finding especially large effects for progressive investments, right? And so this is interesting to think about in light of the research of the literature on welfare states, which has long debated kind of the relative merits, right, of targeted versus universal investments. And so we think that particularly for child and family-focused welfare state investments, targeted investments may be particularly effective, right, in allowing low-resource families to make the same or at least more similar types of investments as their higher SES peers. Okay? And then finally, I'll just say that I think these findings are particularly interesting to think about in light of the fact that, as I showed, the welfare state has contracted, right, for children relative to older adults, at the same time that we're increasingly talking about child-focused investments from the welfare state as a really promising means for reducing, right, the stark types of inequalities that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. So I will stop talking and leave some more time for questions, but thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Democratic candidate Andrew Yang proposed this universal, the universal income, which is, I don't know whether it's a targeted and universal actually investment in your definition, but it can be universal in a sense that it just gives to everyone. It can be targeted because it obviously gives actually cash rather than as education and so on. So I'm wondering whether this difference is really between the target or universal, or is it because the way in which they receive the support is either directly by cash or through the different way of actually receiving, because there's some ethnographic studies show that why EITC matters is because they can get as a lump sum rather than as a portion by month. So I'm just curious about whether you can a little bit about broad even like between target versus universals in the different way of looking at this difference. So that's number one question. Number two, briefly, so I think one of your graphs showed that there's an overall increase in public spending in the United States. Am I right? If that's the case, then I don't understand how this divergent income gap has happening in the United States, because public spending in the United States has increased, which means that probably these kids from the low income will be more benefit from this overall increase. So in other words, there's lots of actually between state variation. Otherwise, we cannot explain this overall increase in diverging income gap, but public spending in the United States overall increase over time. So that means there's lots of actually between state, the variation. So can you, I know that your interest is about within, the state variation, but something.
You're talking about, go back, so this, you're saying, okay, well, this is not showing us how spending overall has increased, right? But spending overall has increased, but it hasn't necessarily increased in a way that has anything to do with children, right? I think that's the point of showing, I don't know if this is getting to your point at all, but a lot of the spending increases, or a lot of the categories of spending that have driven overall spending increases have been spending on adults and defense and things like that. So spending on children has been a really constant, if not declining, right? This is spending on children from 1960 to the projected future. So it's essentially flat, if not declining. So I think that's an important distinction for kids. Your first question, I think, is a really good one and essentially suggests that it would be beneficial to actually break up not even just by domain of public investment, right, but actually within domain looking at kind of cash transfer versus in kind, right? So if you take the case of a program like Medicaid, obviously one of its primary effect on low resource families is not necessarily to, it may increase their ability to spend money on other things because they don't have to pay for health insurance, but it also equally, if not more importantly, is preventing them from losing, right, wealth, for example, or going into bankruptcy. So that kind of in-kind transfer, in contrast to something like EITC or tax credits, right, that are more in the form of cash. So I think that would be really interesting to look at that type of variation. But I think theoretically, there's a lot of reason to do that. And as I was telling some of you this morning, that's one of my next, it's been hard to figure out where to start with this, right? Because there's so much information. And so the first place to start, we thought, was to acknowledge the fact that families access bundles of resources, right? When they access public sector services. And so that's why we're kind of looking at total investment. But I think the logical next step is to just look at specific programs, right? Not even domains, but just like specific programs. So, yeah.
The focus on basically parental input to child development. I wonder if the story you tell lines up with the focus of the country. So are there smaller SES differences in child development, schooling attainment, and social mobility in states that invest more, which would mean that the story that you're telling affects the outputs.
Yes.
That's the next step. We can't do that with the consumer expenditure survey, right? Because we don't have any info about kids' outcomes. So it was kind of like either that or the child outcomes. We started with this, so I think that's the next step. I was telling a few people this morning about the census data linkage projects, and I have this pipe dream of finding the consumer expenditure survey kids in the 2010 census, right? And then looking at mobility, and maybe in 5 years I'll be able to do that. But I think the next step is to look at state variation and child outcomes, which we can do. I don't know. Is the answer. Yeah.
I've looked at parental expenditures and things like private tutoring, activities that are perhaps more expensive, impactful engineering development.
Yeah, we do. So we started to look at that, and one of the main categories so far is childcare expenditures, which I originally had all in the same cost, and it's actually a really different pattern. Because we're seeing for childcare expenditures evidence of widening class gaps across states, at least when we look at total state spending. But I partly didn't show that because it's a lot to do all at once, but also childcare expenditures are tricky because not all of these public sector investments they should affect people's childcare budgets in the same way that we expect. So developmental expenditure would be something that we expect all parents across the economic situation, right, to want to be doing. Whereas childcare expenditures are kind of produced by a lot of, we think that they're produced by a lot of other factors besides just And so I think I'm just going to focus on that. But we haven't gone on to look at we could look at lessons, we could look at some of these activities like organized, for example, are not as relevant a feature of everyday expenditures for low SES families, right? They are for high SES families. So even though they get a lot of attention as the kind of in the media, right, about investment, the average low resource family is not spending very much money on organized lessons, right? And so there's not a huge gradient actually because there's a lot of people more common.
Yeah, this is great, and I really like this project bringing sort of like the institutions into play with all these very important questions. And I have a comment that kind of follows up what Michelle was saying, and it kind of asks a bit thinking about how public expenditure can also shape the behavior of the top as opposed to only focusing on the behavior of the bottom. And the reason for that is because I think, particularly when pertaining to like childcare or like early childhood education in the centers, the way that I would expect like a universalist kind of public investment in public childcare, for instance, would be by changing the prices of that would affect basically the amount of money that a child basically spends on that. So that would be like a different mechanism of narrowing gaps that comes from quote unquote behavior, but here it's really things like prices that suck a lot of the budgets of the kind of like at the top. So I don't know if you're thinking about, like I think that the focus on the formula is important, but I also think that there's probably a lot of
Yeah, no, and for some dimensions of investment, I think it's not at all clear that we would expect a narrowing gap, right? So childcare is one example where, spending on childcare obviously is focused on to your point about age differences, right, on younger kids. And the majority of states still spend very little, right, on public childcare. I mean, federal Head Start is very, very small portion of total educational spending. Public pre-K is not in all states, right, but it's a very small feature of spending. And so it's unlikely to have a huge impact on behavior of low SES families, given its relatively limited prevalence still. And it may actually have an effect on the top of the distribution, right? But for some other features of investment, as I said, like lessons, we may expect, for example, educational spending, and high SES families benefiting from lots of educational investments to then have more money to spend on lessons for their kids, right? Because they're sending their kids to public school instead of private school, whereas that's not the same decision landscape for a lower SES family. And so we wanted to start by picking a form of expenditures that we thought would be equally, plausible, right, for all families across the economic distribution, and that allows a more simple test of this resource pathway. Because once we move beyond that, I think it gets more complicated. So, yeah, but absolutely, I would love to do more of that. Other questions? Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.